everything about how the auto industry develops, grows, expands, and evolves over the near term, but we can impact the way our stations look, feel, and operate in millions of cars and trucks. Thanks to the NAB for the vision and foresight to get behind this initiative. I wish you a great radio show and a great experience behind the wheel. Thank you very much.
Please welcome the President and CEO of the Radio Advertising Bureau, Erica Farmer.
Good afternoon. We're in the final stretch here. So I am delighted to kick off the second part of today's headliner session with an introduction of the founder and CEO of Amplifi Media, Steve Goldstein. Now, Steve is nationally recognized as a leader in radio programming and marketing and management. His track record of success spans virtually every major format for some of the nation's top broadcasting companies. Last year, he founded Amplifi Media, which specializes in strategy and content development for this fast-growing digital on-demand audio sector. Please welcome Steve Goldstein.
Thank you very much, Erica. Very good to be here. I thought I'd start on a down note, though. Since we're in Texas, I think it's kind of important to acknowledge what's been going on. And I have family in Houston. 2 years ago, their home was pretty much wrecked. They live in the Meyerland section, and they rebuilt. Now you're looking at the living room from a couple of days ago. And there they are in the garage getting ready to be rescued. On the top of their garage, and that is my cousin, his son, one of his daughters, and his wife on television being rescued. And this sort of says it all. There he is by a fire truck, and they can't go back to the house. So I don't know exactly what they're going to do, but I know what they're not going to do. They can't rebuild. So here we are in Texas, and I thought I would just do a shout out to everybody from Texas. Stay strong. So, okay, so let's go upbeat here, hopefully a little upbeat, and let's talk about some new platforms, some new opportunities for radio. And fortunately, this guy was kind of wrong. And so he's wrong by about 95 years. So I'm not here today to talk about the end of radio. There have been reports out there about its demise, but it is being challenged. And I think it's really important that we be open-minded about the way people are getting audio. And it's coming from all different sources. And a lot of these sources don't have AM/FM radios in them. And so we need to be mindful of that as we move ahead. And the biggest of the audio platforms is certainly the smartphone. And maybe the change is now, what are we at, 10 years. So this is where own music, podcasts, streaming audio, video reside. These are entertainment hubs, and that is a consequential change of how people consume not just audio, but video. And they take it with them. And maybe the most important statistic I can give you today is this one. This is from Edison Research's share of ear. And 1 out of 5 minutes of all audio listening is occurring on the smartphone. Worth saying one more time. 1 out of 5 minutes of all audio listening is on the smartphone today. And so you know where that number is going to go. It's going to increase. And so we, in radio, need to be mindful of this because we're not doing such a hot job on the smartphone. And then there's this thing, and we'll talk about this a little bit too. 2 years ago, this was sort of like a good thing to order diapers on. And now it's an audio hub, and radio certainly challenged with the amount of radios in the household declining, especially in the younger demos. So this becomes a real opportunity for radio. And it's all about a larger arc, and the arc is time shifting. It's happened on the TV side. More TV is consumed digitally on a time-delayed basis than it is in the linear live mode. And so that's a quantum change, right? We don't sit there anymore and watch Grey's Anatomy on a Thursday night at 8 o'clock. We watch it whenever we want to. And the ratings on something like Grey's Anatomy increase in what they call C3 and C7 with Nielsen television ratings. It goes up as much as 60%. Netflix is the largest television network in the world. And 8 years ago, they were just sending DVDs to people in Omaha. So there's a quantum change, really smart and different business. And then there's this. This is my son, Ben. He's 19 years old. He's at college at the University of Michigan. And he and his friends do not spend a lot of time with radio. He's in the cume. He's in that 93% cume number for sure. But his TSL and his loyalty is not with commercial radio. He is listening a lot to Spotify and podcasts and his own music. And so are his friends. And this is where it's going. This is why we need to be mastering other kinds of audio. And so we call it radio, and it sort of feels like that old box. And I'm going to make a suggestion that you be a little open-minded today, and we talk about audio. And when you change it to audio, something else changes. It becomes more modern for some reason. And here we are in a TV-centric world, and audio is kicking it. I mean, we are doing so well, but not all of the audio is coming from radio. It's coming from all of these other sources and places. And so think about yourselves instead of radio producers as audio producers, and that is a quantum change, right? So let's dig in on podcasting. This is how you know you're doing well. New Yorker Magazine does cartoons about you. So let's talk about podcasting a little bit. It's not niche anymore. 67 million people are listening to podcasts each month, 42 million each week. According to Apple, last year there were 10 billion, with a B, downloads, and there are remarkably 400,000 podcasts. The good news is a lot of those podcasts are not so good. And that's an opportunity for people in the radio business. But they do cover a wide array of topics, and that's really significant. They're more narrow in focus. But this is a stat I think you should walk away with. I gave you the 1 in 5 on smartphones. Now I'm going to give you the 1 in 5 on podcasts. 1 in 5 Americans are listening to podcasts on a monthly basis. And demographically, it's pretty young. 29. That's the average, that's the median age for podcasts, which is, when you compare it to any other media, remarkably attractive. And a lot of media and advertisers are looking to reach these hard to get to millennials. The average age for, the median age for commercial radio is 46, which is really good. Commercial television at night is 54, primetime TV. Cable news, just to give you another stat, is in the mid-60s. So 29 is really quite sweet. About 10% of all audio, well, let me frame it a little bit differently. About 20% of all audio is spoken word. Of that 20%, 10% is podcasting. And of that number, you can see in this chart that 28% is occurring in 13 to 34. So in other words, it's growing young. That matches the 29 number I just showed you. And if, say, you're running a news talk station and you're 55 plus, not as big. But the lower demo, that's where it's happening, and happening fairly rapidly. Did a study with New Voodoo, Carolyn Gilbert's company, that we debuted at Podcast Movement, a conference that was on 2 weeks ago. And this is the average number of podcasts that people listen to, those who are into podcasts, of course. And podcast listeners, interestingly, are big audio listeners. They spend more time with audio. Look to the number on the right-hand side. But the downside for commercial radio is their loyalty starts to shift from commercial radio to podcasts. So you see the radio number go down, the podcast number go up, but all of audio goes up. And just to give you a flavor of how much the downloads are, and we're in sort of this weird download environment right now. NPR does about 93 million downloads a month with 12 million users, just rolling along there. ESPN has about 28 million and 4 million users. The New York Times, which I'll show you later, really heavily into podcasting, 3 million. And I have Dave Ramsey up here because of the top 50 podcasts, only one comes from commercial radio, and it's Dave. And I was meeting with Brian from Dave Ramsey earlier, and he tells me my number is wrong, and I'm proud to inform you that that number is 12 million. So he's doing really well. We need to get more commercial radio in there. In fact, only 1% of all audio being consumed in podcasting comes from commercial radio. Tisk, tisk. We are the greatest audio producers ever. We should be doing a better job here. It's really important that we jump in on this. And why? Why? Because there's retention, audience retention, as more people use these devices. There's growth. There's a ton of evidence that public radio has built a new audience for itself by being in podcasts. So 54 years old is the average age of a NPR listener, but you can drop 15 years off of that for their podcast audience. People who have never gone on to the transmitter to listen to NPR are discovering it through podcasts. And then finally, relevance. 3 types, quickly. The first is time shifted. A lot of stations have started here, taking things like the morning show and putting that out there. That is modestly working well for some radio stations. But here's the opportunity. So this is the time spent listening from 4 shows. And you can see that its average quarter hours are about 3 per morning. Okay, so 45 minutes, not bad. But when you do the math on how many quarter hours there are in a morning show over the course of a week, not good. 80% of that content is missed. So why can't we take some of the best stuff and put it out there for people to listen to at a time of their choosing, right? They have lives. They have now been conditioned to listen to audio and certainly watch video at a time of their choosing. So there's great opportunity in there. Do not recommend, however, a 3-hour podcast. It's a really bad idea. People didn't have time to listen to your morning show to begin with. Even in archived form, they're not likely to have 3 hours. So you probably want to curate it for them so they don't have to do that. There's another form of audio here which is very underutilized by radio, and part of that has been because it's been difficult to do. But there are new tools, Facebook, Twitter, and other social media are now friendlier for clips. They're much more TV-oriented, but becoming more audio-oriented. And I think about this in terms of how significant it's been for television. So this, who was James Corden before he started doing carpool karaoke? This has had over 200 million views, really significant. The Late Show with Stephen Colbert debuted. The ratings were not so good. They repositioned the show. They made it more political, which is really in his DNA. And how did they get the word out that he had changed the program? They used social media. And then this one, and I get this one a lot. You know, if we put our stuff up into social media, we're gonna damage our on-air ratings, and ratings are too hard for us to get to begin with. So no, we're not going to do that. Well, you know what? It doesn't really work that way. Sure, the times that we live in are pretty wacky, and so SNL has had a lot of great material to work with. But here's the significant part. They had the best on-air season in 24 years, but they also, whoops, I don't have that slide, 48% increase in their YouTube video watching. So both metrics went up for them. So it was quite accretive. Original content is the holy grail. This is a look at the podcast chart from this past week. Most of the content here is not repurposed content, it's original, and that's because podcast content really is different in many ways and structurally than general audio content. And when you look at the podcast chart, you see a lot of fresh voices and a lot of fresh topics, and that is key. People are looking for different audio experiences, and it's important that you give it to them. So here's a quick rundown of what it looks like in the differences between podcasts and broadcast. So broadcast, we do a great job. It's lean back. You want to listen to an all news station, they're putting together the news and the weather and the traffic and the sports. And if you're listening to a morning show, they put together all the interesting things of the day or the previous day and giving it to you in the morning. Really well done. That's what the lean back experience is. Lean forward is what podcasting is about. You have to go to the smartphone or wherever you're going to get this stuff from, and you're going to have to choose to listen to it. So that's a different experience. When you listen to the radio, we're always joining in progress, right? The show is always on. But in podcasting, everybody begins at the same point. They're beginning at the start, the beginning. So the architecture is fundamentally different. In radio, we know that we must capture their attention right away, or potentially they go listen to something else. Well, in podcasting, a little bit different. It's appointment listening. My daughter listens to podcasts when she walks to work. She listens at whatever it is, 7:30 in the morning. That's her appointment listening. She's starting it right then and there. Radio, wide appeal. We know that we need to be as big as we can be. It's a big tent medium. That's how you garner ratings. But in podcasting, you can pick out a topic and go narrowly. There are, by the way, 27 podcasts on woodworking. It's a category. I met a guy at Podcast Movement. He has a business on HVAC, air conditioning systems. He runs a podcast in that category, and he's killing it. He has sponsors, and he is doing a great job. Who would think HVAC would be a podcast category? But it is. In radio, we're used to perishable content. We put it out over the air, it goes to the dwarf planet Pluto, and we never hear it again. But now we have a means to retain that content and put it out there at a different time. It's archived. It's always available. How cool is that? That's what television has had. Now radio has it too. And broadcast is always on. Here, there's the stop, start, delete button. And by the way, people do stop, start, and delete podcasts as well. I mentioned Podcast Movement. 2,000 people there. 2,000 people focused on creating audio, and they're really not radio people. They are energized on audio. Radio's opportunity, I think, is local. Think about your DNA. Your DNA is local, and it is starting. Here are a couple of examples, and in just a moment I'm going to bring out one of the great examples, Kirk from WEEI, Tom Bernard, legendary morning show from Minneapolis, does a great podcast only experience. Rachel Bell from Cairo in Seattle has a podcast called Your Last Meal. Great podcast. She's interviewing famous people from Seattle and beyond. Capital Culture, TOP in Washington, about entertainment. Bobbycast is Bobby Bones from Premiere, and Bobby interviews top country music artists and gets hundreds of thousands of downloads. Flavor 574 comes from South Bend, Indiana, and it's local food, and it's balanced with the local website. It's great. And BJ Shea does a podcast out of KISW in Seattle on his passion, which is technology and comics and geekdom, which the program director said, God, you got to stop talking about this stuff so much on the air, and rooted it into a podcast. And now both things are going well. Elvis Duran and his crew, they have 8 original podcasts. The biggest of which is from Bethany, who does her own show. She's one of the co-hosts of the show, but she does her own podcast. So a couple of attributes for successful podcasting is, why this podcast now? I mentioned there are 27 on woodworking. If you want to be the 28th, you better be really good. So it's got to be unique, and the first 5 minutes, not unlike radio, is critical. High CPMs, crazy CPMs, $25, $30. Live reads, really important. People pay extra for live reads and endorsements, and that's something that I think has been missing from radio, but it's really effective. And as I mentioned earlier, niche targets. And podcast ads are quite memorable. About $220 million in the category, not quite the $15 billion of the radio business, but growing rapidly, and money is moving into this sector. Sales activation, it is not a CPM sell, it's sponsorship. I mentioned the live reads. And for your sales department, it's audio. Audio, imagine that. Rather than selling audience extension or some of the other digital programs, this one is a native sell for a lot of people. Measurement, early days, kind of prehistoric stuff with downloads, but that's changing, and it is accretive. If you listen to the audio and within 24 hours in the Nielsen ratings, there you go. You can actually build and retain audience like television does. Quickly on smart speakers, this is a big deal. This is happening very quickly. There are 20,000 skills, that's what Amazon calls it, skills developed. Some of them are really great, some of them are really miserable, but everybody is piling on to do them. But the thing that people are doing more than anything else with these devices is listening to audio. And so that's a great opportunity for everybody in this room. And it's somewhere between 7 and 11% of homes that have access. And audio listening goes up. People are listening to more audio, according to Edison Research, when they have these devices. However, caution, caution, there's 400,000 podcasts on these devices, 100,000 stations from TuneIn and iHeart and streaming services. And Fred mentioned earlier that SiriusXM is diversifying while they're on these devices. And so just having your stream up there is probably not good enough. It probably doesn't give you the distinctive tone that you need to be out there. And we started a company called Sonic AI where we're developing skills that take you beyond the stream. So I think that's going to be valuable. The TV guys are jumping in on this really fast, and that's important. So who's going to own the local? And what's your name? So if you go onto the device and you say Light FM, you do get Light FM, but you get Light FM from, I swear this is true, Beirut, Lebanon. Yes, there is a Light FM in Beirut, Lebanon, and the slogan is the feel-good station. Go ahead and try it. You can't make this stuff up. And then, really important, there are morning shows coming from other places. I mentioned the New York Times, and the Daily is a big deal. It's got hundreds of thousands of listeners every morning, and it came from a crew that had never done audio before. And BuzzFeed introduced just a couple of weeks ago this thing called Reporting to You, and it was designed for the Amazon Alexa, but it's also a podcast. It's a 4-minute millennial news feed, and it's coming from them, and they're thinking about audio, and same thing with the Vox guys. So let's talk about how this can really work, and I want to bring out Kirk Minihane from WEEI in Boston, who is graciously come down to talk about his podcast, which is killing it. He's doing about 200,000 downloads per podcast. Come on out, Kirk. Let's have a little conversation about all of this. So Kirk is morning show co-host at EEI, Monster Radio Station in Boston. And you got into podcasting pretty early compared to most radio people. What brought you there?
Well, I guess a couple of things. First of all, when I signed my last deal, that was kind of part of the conversation. But I had listened to podcasts for a long time, and I wanted to do one. I did want to do one. I felt, you know, as you talked about with one of these other shows, I forget which one, some guy had some focus, and the PD told him to get away from that and do something else. That PD sounds like a dummy to me, by the way. If the guy's passionate about it, you should talk about it as much as you can. Anyway, so I found that I wanted to talk to people long form, and an opportunity I couldn't do it in the radio show. I mean, it's formatted. You only have 10 or 12 minutes, and I think guests stink up. So if you have them in a podcast form where it's longer form, it's somebody you're interested in, I thought that was a different opportunity. There wasn't a lot of that out there, particularly in Boston.
And so what is it? What's on a typical podcast that you have?
I mean, it really depends. I mean, one week we might have an author from some book I like. The next week we might have an athlete, although we don't have a lot of those. We might have a comedian, an actor. It really is something. If I'm passionate about the person, if it's somebody I want to talk to for 40, 45 minutes, I'll bring them on. It doesn't matter how high profile they are.
And how do you cross-promote it? And did you run into that problem with the radio station saying, oh my God, we're going to have audio here and this guy?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting divide. I think there's sort of this line, and I don't know if it's age or experience or what it is. I think some people think it's a bad thing. It's not. I mean, podcasts aren't going anywhere now. Our station I was lucky with our station. We had people in management who wanted this to happen. So they promoted it within, they'll do commercials during the day for it. And the other thing is, if it's something that's interesting, like I had Lenny Dykstra on from the Mets on a podcast, and we went back and forth screaming at each other for 10 minutes. So we play it the next day on the air. And so that's sort of a cross-promotion that I think wasn't available before. So we do a lot of that when it's interesting. Now, I mean, listen, not all of them are great, but when they're good, we play and we promote it.
Well, and that seems so simple and smart, and yet, my experience with a lot of radio guys is they're afraid to do that. They're afraid to push people off the main signal. What have you seen in terms of your ratings and the podcast downloads?
Well, our ratings are we're the number one rated show now in Boston. I think we're the number one rated morning show in America right now. I think, at least I know. I think we might have moved up one notch today in the morning shows across America. But I would say this: a year ago we were number 2, number 3 in Boston, and when you look at our 25 to 34 right now, that number has gone up in the last year since I started doing this podcast, last year and a half. Is that related? I think it is. When I look at Twitter and I see the mentions for the podcast, I'll look at their avatars, look at who they are. 8 out of 10, I think, are younger than, say, 35 years old. So, I mean, I could come to no other conclusion other than that has helped. I don't think the audience sounds younger now. It is younger. I think it's a fact.
And the number of downloads on a monthly basis, roughly?
It depends. I mean, we got about 50, 60,000. So it's a couple 100,000 a month, and it's still north of 100,000. I do 2 a month now, but on average, I have a sort of an average base, which is somewhere between 50 and 60,000. When it spikes, it can go up to over 100,000, but it doesn't generally go lower than that.
And I should mention, of that 400,000 podcasts that are out there, the 50,000 mark is pretty high turf. I mean, there's only 1% of all podcasts that are above 50,000. So congratulations.
Yeah, well, thanks. Now, I'd like to see more local guys do this stuff, but I think you talked about it before. They have to be passionate about it. If they're not passionate about it, I would tell them, if I'm the PD or management, I'd tell them not to do it. Don't waste our time. Don't waste your time. We don't want to promote it because it's going to be lousy. If you care about it, it'll be good.
I'm also curious, do you get the sense that the podcast is reaching new audience, people that weren't listening?
Yeah.
I mean, I know you said the ratings are up, but walk me through that.
I mean, it depends. I think when like I said, I think that core base now listens to our show no matter what. But when something spikes, whether I get in a fight with somebody, or I have a big guest, or it's something we promote, yeah, I mean, you can definitely feel it. But I would tell everyone out here. I think you said the average age was 28 or 29 for podcast listeners. I believe that. I that sounds about right to me.
When you launched, walk us through the process. How did you figure out what it was going to be called and what it was going to be about?
Yeah, management came up with a name, so it's sort of a play on, I guess, within the world of our show. There's this idea that I have this big ego. So they came up with the idea of Enough About Me as sort of a joke. Now, of course, the podcast, ironically, is still only really about me. I mean, we bring the guests on. Ultimately, it's still about me. But Phil Zachary, who's a VP at our station, came up with that idea. And they really left me alone. Tim Murphy, Phil Zachary, Joe Zarbano, the program director, said, you have an idea, go do it. We can tell you're passionate about it. We believe in you. And so far, it's worked. And, you see these podcasts all the time where they start out, they do one. Then they do one the next week. Then they don't do it for a couple of weeks. They come back. Then it's 4 or 5 weeks, and all of a sudden it's gone. And we have that problem at our station too. And I think if you're a sports PD out there, I would say to them, don't do a sports podcast. You talk about sports all day. Find something else you like and talk about that.
And when you book the show? Are you thinking I'm a sports station, it has to be sports?
No.
Or
Definitely not. I mean, I would say our show isn't even a sports show anyway, but I would say that, just the opposite. Ben Kinchin, who's my producer for the podcast, does a great job. He books it. Like I said, if there's a book I like or a movie I like or somebody in the news I like or somebody I know I'm going to fight with, let's find that guy and let's do it. I mean, I don't think there's anything more boring than two guys who get along. I mean, I wouldn't mind, fighting with you about something. You have anything you want to talk about? I mean, let's.
I'm from the New York area, so I'm a Yankees guy. So you can go in on that if you want.
There you go. Yeah. So, but I mean, I do think that that's important. But like I said, I mean, I'm flying back tomorrow through Atlanta. If I pick up a book and and I'm reading it, and there's an author I like, I'll text Ben and say, let's see if we get this guy. I don't care if anybody knows who he is. I know I like him. So if the listeners like it or the podcast people like it, good luck. If they don't, that's fine too.
So one of the things that you had mentioned to me is that you were into podcasts before you were into your podcast.
Yeah.
What are you listening to?
It kind of varies all the time. I mean, unlike everybody else, I'll kind of pick and choose. When Mark Maron has a good guest, it's really good. I like Serial Season 1. I thought Serial Season 2 is awful. There's a podcast I'm listening to right now, Accused, that's really good. I listen to a couple of running podcasts. A couple of political ones, though. I don't think there are any great ones that I like right now that are out there. But there are sort of 5 or 6 different ones I listen to. And I will say this, I listen to a lot of them when I run. And it's different when you're running and the person's hosting. If they do a good job with the reads in the middle of it, it seems perfectly natural to me. Sometimes you're listening to the radio, you tune out. But if it's a good podcast person and they're doing a good job with it, you actually listen and it's in your head and you think, okay, that product might be interesting to me.
When we spoke, there was a word that came up a couple of times about authenticity.
Yeah.
What's the difference? How can you characterize the difference between the broadcast and the podcast, and what's different with you?
I hope not a lot. The only thing, obviously, is, like I said, I'm not a huge fan of guests on the radio. I think it just doesn't work. It's forced. You have to jam it in a certain amount of time. With this one, I'm sort of, all kidding aside, sort of letting this person have the stage. I'm going to ask them questions and get out of the way. That's sort of the big difference. But I think me, personally, I don't change a lot. I mean, I get to swear, although I swear sometimes on the radio, too. That's allowed, right? I don't think that seems...
No problem at all. David Field, I'm sure, is out here right now.
Huge advocate of that. But yeah, no, there's that part of it, and it gets more conversational, I guess. But I think our show's pretty conversational. Honestly, I tried to bring a lot of what we do on the show to the podcast.
So you are how many episodes in?
65, maybe 66.
65 episodes. So there's a term. You mentioned a lot of guys start a podcast and then they lose interest. There's a term called pod fade.
Yeah.
And of that 400,000 podcasts, about 100,000 are gone.
I believe that. I'm surprised it's only that many. It's not hard, but it's hard to sort of every couple of weeks or every week find a guest. But then sometimes, I'll just because I'm a dummy with technology, I finally figured out you can actually record. You can talk into your phone. I didn't even know that till a month ago. So sometimes I'll just do that and what's on my mind for 10 or 15 minutes, and we'll send it out.
So what recommendations do you have for anybody out here who's thinking about it?
The one thing I would honestly say, and I know I said it before, but if you're a person on air and there's something that you're passionate about and you don't get to talk about it that much on the air, but you think it's good and you think people are going to care about it, talk about it and find guests who are interested in it too and talk about that. And you're not going to get the same audience as the radio show. We understand that. But if you find a core loyal audience, week in, week out, advertisers will follow, and people will like the show. And you'll occasionally get somebody who doesn't know who you are, who's never listened to you on the radio, says, "I like this person. You know what? I'm going to turn the radio on and see what they're like for 4 hours or 3 hours." And guess what? They might stick around.
Best podcast you did?
I'll tell you one One that I really liked was we had Kareem Abdul-Jabbar on the podcast. Okay. And about 10 minutes in, his publicist came on and said, "We can't do this. We have to go." I asked him a question about race in Boston, which I don't know if you guys have heard. There's some reputation about race in Boston. So I asked Kareem about this, and they got us off the phone. And so I said, this podcast was awful. So what I decided to do was break down the anatomy of an awful podcast, basically a director's cut. I would stop and say, this was terrible, here's where this went wrong. I like doing that. And then I did one in Maine a few months ago. Both my parents passed away this summer. And I reflected on that sort of for 15, 20 minutes. Wasn't sure I wanted to send it out. Wound up sending it out. And what we actually did was, I wasn't on the air, But Jerry Callahan, my co-host, said, we're going to play it on the air, and they replayed it Friday morning on the air, the entire podcast, which, again, is, I wish it obviously didn't happen, but is sort of this cross-promotion. The other thing, the most successful podcast at our station by far is mine. The second most successful one is our two producers who, if you watch them right now, they wouldn't be able to walk on this stage, honestly. I mean, we're talking about two historically dumb people, but they do an entertaining podcast, and they talk about the show and gossip, and then if it's really good sometimes, we'll then the next day make fun of them from their podcast talking about us. So it's sort of this endless weird cross-promotion that has worked.
And you also have the meltdown of the show every day, the radio show. So there's another.
Correct. Yeah, you also have that. That's exactly right. Yeah. So it's sort of.
And how does that come about? How do you choose what goes into that?
That's more the producers, which, as I said, is probably not the best idea, but we let them handle it, and they do a pretty good job with it, all kidding aside. And the other big change now is within the life of the show, they will tweet out 15, 20-minute segments and sort of send out our hour one, hour two best of, which is totally different than even like a year and a half ago. It's all changing fast.
Cannot thank you enough for coming
Sure.
down here to talk about this. I could stand here with PowerPoints all day long, but you are doing it, and it is the perfect model for radio. So
I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I'm ending on a high note. That we're going out with that. So you should get into the podcasting thing and follow this model. So thank you very much. I appreciate the time today.
Great job. Thanks again to Fred Jacobs, Steve Goldstein, and Kirk for sharing their insights with us today. Also, thanks once more to Dan Spears and BMI and Robert Earl Keane for that great performance.